Antietam Creek does not announce itself like a place where history is about to break open. It moves quietly through Washington County, Maryland, near the town of Sharpsburg, bending through a landscape of farms, hills, open fields, woodlots, lanes, and stone crossings. In ordinary times, it was part of a rural geography, water for fields and families, a natural line in the countryside, a feature to be crossed on the way from one place to another. East of Sharpsburg, the creek ran below ridges and rises that gave the ground its shape. Roads connected farms. Bridges carried local traffic. Fields stood ready for harvest. Churches, barns, and family houses marked a settled community. And then, on September 17, 1862, this quiet landscape became the center of the bloodiest single day in American military history. The battle fought here is known by two names. In the north, it became Antietam, after the creek. In the south, it was often called Sharpsburg, after the nearby town. Both names point to the same place and to the same terrible fact. In roughly 12 hours of combat, Union and Confederate armies suffered more than 22,000 casualties. Men were killed, wounded, captured, or missing in numbers so large that the scale still resists easy understanding. Common estimates place the total around 22,717, and often close to 23,000. Whatever exact figure is used, the meaning is clear. No single day in American military history had been bloodier. The armies that converged here were commanded by two men whose names had already become central to the war. The Union Army of the Potomac was led by Major General George B. McClellan. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was led by General Robert E. Lee. Around them moved forces that together numbered on the scale of entire cities, approximately 87,000 Union troops and 45,000 Confederate troops engaged, about 132,000 soldiers in all. But numbers alone do not explain Antietam. They can measure the size of the armies. They can count the dead and wounded. They can mark the hours from dawn to sunset. What they cannot fully capture is the contradiction at the heart of this battle. Antietam is often described as tactically inconclusive. Neither army was destroyed. No clean battlefield annihilation followed. Lee's army was battered, but it was not crushed where it stood. McClellan's army held the field, but the victory was incomplete. The fighting surged across the northern part of the field, around Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunker Church. It tore through the center, along the sunken road, later remembered as Bloody Lane. It ground against the southern crossing known in 1862 as the Rohrbach or Lower Bridge, later famous as Burnside Bridge. It rose again in the late afternoon during the final attack sector, when the Union left pushed forward before being checked. At the end of the day, the landscape was devastated. The battle lines had shifted. The casualties were immense. Yet the military result seemed, in one sense, unfinished. And still, Antietam changed the course of the Civil War. That is the central question of this story. How could a battle that did not produce a clear tactical destruction become a national turning point? How could fields near a Maryland creek alter the meaning of the war itself? The answer begins with what Antietam stopped. In the late summer of 1862, Robert E. Lee had carried the war northward into Maryland. This was his first invasion of the North. The campaign was a gamble, intended to move the fighting away from the South, threaten federal territory, possibly affect Northern politics, and encourage European recognition of the Confederacy. By the time the armies faced each other near Sharpsburg, the stakes were not only military. They were political, diplomatic, and psychological. If Lee could operate successfully on Northern soil, the Confederacy might appear stronger than its resources suggested. If Union armies could not stop him, Northern confidence might weaken. Foreign governments, watching from across the Atlantic, might see a rebellion capable of surviving, perhaps even deserving recognition. The outcome in Maryland mattered far beyond the ridges along Antietam Creek. The battle did not destroy Lee's army, but it ended his first invasion of the North. After Antietam, Lee withdrew back across the Potomac River into Virginia. That movement mattered. It meant the Confederate advance into Maryland had failed to achieve the larger result it sought. It gave the Union something it badly needed, not a perfect victory, but enough of a victory to change the political moment. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This was not an isolated document appearing out of nowhere. Lincoln had been waiting for a moment in which emancipation could be tied to Union strength rather than desperation. Antietam gave him that opening. The battle allowed the administration to present the proclamation not as a cry after defeat, but as a measure following a strategic check against Lee's invasion. In that sense, the fields near Sharpsburg helped create the conditions for one of the most consequential acts of the war. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation announced a transformation in the character of the conflict. The war had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union. After Antietam and after Lincoln's proclamation, Union victory became increasingly tied to the destruction of slavery as well as reunion. The final Emancipation Proclamation would be issued on January 1, 1863. It applied to areas in rebellion while exempting loyal slaveholding border states and some Confederate areas already under Union control. That limitation mattered deeply in Maryland. The battlefield itself lay in a loyal border state where slavery still existed. The proclamation did not free enslaved people in Maryland. The National Park Service notes that roughly 87,000 enslaved people in the state were not freed by it because Maryland remained in the Union. Maryland would abolish slavery through a new state constitution in 1864. So even here, where the military turning point helped make emancipation policy possible, freedom came unevenly through law, war, politics, and time. Antietam forced a new national direction, but that direction did not unfold simply or all at once. The contradiction remains part of the place. Antietam was a battlefield of terrible violence, but its meaning reaches beyond the violence. It was a tactical struggle in farm fields and along roads, but also a strategic halt to invasion. It was a day of failed breakthroughs and partial successes, but also a political opening. It was fought in a slaveholding border state, not immediately freed by the proclamation it helped enable. It was both an end and a beginning. To stand in the story of Antietam is to hold these truths together. The creek was not merely scenery. The hills, roads, open ground, woodlots, and bridges shaped how armies moved and where men died. Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church, Bloody Lane, Burnside Bridge, and the final attack sector were not symbols at first. They were features of a working rural landscape. War turned them into landmarks. But before the battle concentrated along Antietam Creek, before the dawn attacks and the long day of fire, before the wounded filled farms and barns, before Alexander Gardner's photographs carried images of battlefield death to the public, Lee had to cross into Maryland. He had to make the gamble that brought his army north of the Potomac and placed Sharpsburg on the road to a national turning point. The quiet creek was waiting before the storm. The storm began with an invasion. The storm began not with cannon along Antietam Creek, but with movement. Before Sharpsburg became a name tied to the bloodiest single day in American military history, it was part of a wider Confederate campaign. General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland in September of 1862, carrying the war onto ground that was not Virginia, not the deep interior of the Confederacy, and not a place the United States government could ignore. This was the Maryland campaign. It was not simply a march northward. It was a wager. Lee's army had fought long and hard in Virginia, where war had already torn through farms, towns, roads, and rail lines. By moving into Maryland, Lee sought to shift the fighting away from the South. That goal mattered in the most practical sense. Armies consumed landscapes. They needed roads, fields, food, and space. They damaged the places through which they moved, even before battle began. To carry the campaign into Maryland was to relieve some pressure on Confederate territory, if only for a time, and to force the Union Army to respond somewhere else. But Lee's crossing also had a larger meaning. Maryland was federal territory. It was a loyal border state, a slaveholding state that had remained in the Union. Its position gave the campaign an edge that was military, political, and symbolic all at once. When Confederate troops entered Maryland, they were not just maneuvering on a map. They were threatening the ground near the heart of Union power. They were bringing the war closer to Northern communities, Northern voters, and the government that directed the Union war effort. The campaign asked a dangerous question. What would happen if the Confederacy could carry the war into the North and survive there? For Lee, the move held several possible advantages. If fighting could be shifted away from the South, Confederate territory might gain breathing room. If federal territory could be threatened, Union commanders would have to react, perhaps hurriedly, perhaps under pressure. If the campaign unsettled Northern politics, it might weaken support for the war. And if the Confederacy could show strength on Northern soil, European governments watching from across the Atlantic might be more inclined to recognize the Confederacy as a nation. That last hope was not a small matter. The Confederacy needed more than battlefield victories. It needed legitimacy. Recognition by European powers would not automatically decide the war, but it could change how the conflict was understood abroad and how the Confederacy was treated in the world. A successful campaign in Maryland might suggest that the Confederate cause was not merely surviving, but advancing. So the crossing into Maryland carried weight beyond the columns of soldiers moving over roads. It was part of a strategy aimed at time, perception, morale, and politics. Lee was attempting to change the setting of the war, and, by doing so, change the possibilities of the war. Yet every part of that strategy depended on risk. An army on campaign is never just an army in motion. It is a fragile system. Men, animals, wagons, ammunition, food, orders, roads, rivers, and timing all have to hold together. The deeper an army moves, the more exposed it can become. The farther it operates from its own base of security, the more it depends on discipline, coordination, and the ability to predict the enemy's response. Lee's movement into Maryland promised opportunity, but it also created danger. He was no longer simply defending Confederate ground. He was operating on federal soil under the eyes of an enemy that could bring large forces against him. The Union Army that would oppose him was the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major Doc, General George B. McClellan. By the time the campaign concentrated near Antietam Creek, the scale would be immense. The American Battlefield Trust lists approximately 87,000 Union troops and 45,000 Confederate troops engaged at Antietam for about 132,000 total forces. Those figures belong to the battle itself, but they help reveal the size of the forces drawn into Lee's gamble. This was not a raid meant to vanish before contact. It was a campaign that could become a major confrontation. And it did. But before that confrontation hardened into the terrible geography of Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church, the Sunken Road, and the Lower Bridge, the war was still moving. The landscape had not yet been fixed into sectors of death. The names that would later become inseparable from Antietam were still farms, roads, woods, and crossings in Washington County, Maryland. The battle had not yet arranged itself around Antietam Creek. The armies were still searching, marching, dividing, concentrating, and reacting. That is one of the quiet tensions of the Maryland campaign. The battle that followed can seem, in memory, almost inevitable. We look back from September 17, 1862, and see the field as if every road led there from the beginning. But the campaign was not born as a single fixed battle plan around Sharpsburg. It was a series of movements shaped by ambition and danger. Lee crossed into Maryland with purposes that reached far beyond one creek. He wanted to shift the burden of war. He wanted to threaten federal territory. He wanted to test the political will of the North. He wanted the world to see the Confederacy as powerful enough to command attention. The gamble was that all of these things might be achieved before the Union could force a reckoning on terms that would destroy his army. Maryland itself made the gamble more complicated. It was not Confederate soil, but it was not a simple northern landscape either. It was a loyal border state where slavery still existed in 1862. That fact would matter deeply in the aftermath of Antietam, because the Emancipation Proclamation would not free enslaved people in Maryland. The state's loyalty to the Union placed it outside the areas to which the proclamation would later apply. The contradiction was stark. The battle that helped open the way for a new national policy against slavery was fought in a state where roughly 87,000 enslaved people were not freed by that policy. But in early September, before the battle and before Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Maryland was first a campaign space. Roads led toward places that would soon become important in the unfolding story: Harpers Ferry, Martinsburg, Boonesboro, Hagerstown, and the mountain gaps west of Frederick. These names were not scenery. They were connected to movement, timing, supply, and military choice. They would become part of the mechanism that brought the armies together near Sharpsburg. Lee's campaign required coordination across that landscape. Confederate forces had to move with purpose through Maryland and around key points. Union forces had to find them, understand their intentions, and respond. In war, information can be as decisive as numbers. A commander who knows where an enemy is going may act with speed. A commander who guesses wrongly may lose the moment. That is why Lee's Maryland campaign, for all its strategic ambition, also depended on paper. Orders had to be written. Routes had to be named. Columns had to be directed toward specific towns and objectives. The intentions of an army had to be translated into instructions that subordinate commanders could follow. These were ordinary acts of command, but in September of 1862, one such act would become extraordinary. While the campaign moved across Maryland, while Lee's gamble unfolded on federal territory, a set of orders would lay out Confederate movements involving Martinsburg, Harpers Ferry, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. Those orders would be issued on September 9, 1862, when Lee's army was camped on the best farm. They would carry the plain administrative title, Special Orders Number 191. For a moment, they were only instructions within an army on the march. Then a copy was lost. And in that small accident, the grand gamble of the Maryland campaign entered one of the most dramatic intelligence moments of the Civil War. For a moment, it was only paper, not a battlefield, not a charge, not a bridge under fire or a road filled with wounded men. Just an order, written in the machinery of command, carrying instructions from General Robert E. Lee to the separated parts of the Army of Northern Virginia. But war often turns on things that look small before they become enormous. On September 9, 1862, while Lee's army was camped on the best farm during the Maryland campaign, Special Orders Number 191 was issued. Its title was plain, bureaucratic, almost forgettable. It did not sound like something that could alter the rhythm of an invasion. It did not sound like something that could help set the stage for the bloodiest single day in American military history. Yet inside that order was the shape of Lee's campaign. The Confederate Army had crossed into Maryland with large ambitions, but it was not moving as a single compact body. It had problems to solve and objectives to reach. The campaign was not simply a march northward. It required coordination across roads, towns, river crossings, and enemy positions. Special Orders Number 191 gave structure to that movement. It outlined Confederate operations involving Martinsburg, Harpers Ferry, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. Those place names mattered because they were not just dots on a map. They were points in a living military system. Martinsburg and Harpers Ferry were connected to the federal presence in the lower Shenandoah Valley and along the Potomac. Boonesboro and Hagerstown were part of the Maryland landscape through which Lee's army was moving. To understand the order is to see the campaign not as one straight line, but as a set of moving parts, each dependent on timing, distance, and obedience. Lee's gamble in Maryland required confidence. It required speed. It required commanders to move where they were supposed to move, when they were supposed to move there. The order was meant to make that possible. And then one copy disappeared from Confederate control. 4 days after the order was issued, on September 13, 1862, members of Company F, 27th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, found a copy. The location was on or near what is now Monocacy National Battlefield. The discovery has become one of the most famous intelligence episodes of the Civil War, partly because of what was found, and partly because of how ordinary the object seemed. The order was in an envelope with 2 cigars. There is something almost cinematic in that detail, but it should not be treated as decoration. The envelope and cigars make the story memorable because they pull high command down into the physical world of campaigning soldiers. Armies were not abstractions. They moved with paper, tobacco, haversacks, saddles, wagons, dispatches, and improvised routines. Decisions made by generals still had to survive dust, fatigue, and the confusion of movement. Somewhere between issuance and discovery, this copy of Lee's operational order had been separated from the Confederate chain of command. By September 13th, it was in Union hands. In another context, it might have been misunderstood. It might have been delayed. It might have been passed over as just another scrap of military paperwork found in the field. But this was not just any paperwork. It was an enemy army's plan, exposed at a moment when the Army of the Potomac was searching for Lee in Maryland. The copy reached Majorette, General George B. McClellan, the same day it was found. For McClellan, this was the kind of intelligence commanders dream of and distrust at the same time. Before him was information that appeared to reveal the structure of Lee's movements. It pointed to Confederate operations involving Martinsburg, Harpers Ferry, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. It showed that Lee's army was divided in the midst of the Maryland campaign. That was the crucial fact. An invading army on hostile or uncertain ground is dangerous. A divided invading army can be vulnerable. If a Union commander could move quickly enough, he might strike separated Confederate forces before they could reunite. He might turn Lee's boldness into exposure. He might do more than stop the invasion. He might damage or even destroy the army that had carried it across the Potomac. This is why Special Orders No. 191 has such power in the Antietam story. It does not belong to the battlefield itself, but it changes how we approach the battlefield. It creates a moment of possibility before the killing at Sharpsburg. For a brief period, McClellan possessed something rare, not rumor, not guesswork, not fragments from scouts alone, but the enemy's own operational instructions. Yet intelligence is not the same as victory. That distinction sits at the center of this chapter. The lost order gave McClellan knowledge, but knowledge still had to be converted into movement. Movement had to be converted into battle. Battle had to be converted into decision. Between paper and outcome stood roads, mountains, garrisons, marching columns, delays, resistance, and the stubborn uncertainty that defines war, even when an enemy's plans have been revealed. Lee had divided his army in pursuit of campaign objectives, including movements connected to Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg. McClellan now had a window into that design. But the window would not stay open forever. Confederate forces could move. Orders could be completed. Columns could reunite. The advantage of knowing an enemy's plan begins to fade the moment the plan is read, because from that instant forward, time becomes the central enemy. This was the pressure placed on the Army of the Potomac after September 13th. The discovery did not erase Lee's skill, nor did it remove the danger of the campaign. It did not make the roads shorter or the mountains lower. It did not guarantee that Union forces would arrive in time to prevent every Confederate objective. But it did change the tempo. It forced the Union High Command to confront a rare opportunity. Lee's army was not simply somewhere in Maryland. Its movements had been exposed in relation to specific places: Martinsburg, Harper's Ferry, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. Those names now became more than geography. They became a clock. Harper's Ferry, in particular, mattered deeply in the chain of events leading to Antietam. Its fate would shape where Confederate forces were and when they could return. Boonesboro would sit near the approaches through the mountain gaps. Hagerstown stood within the broader movement of Lee's army in western Maryland. Martinsburg belonged to the pattern of Confederate operations aimed at Federal positions and supplies in the region. The order connected these places into one design. Its loss allowed the Union Army to see that design. Still, what followed was not the clean, decisive destruction that a perfect intelligence windfall might suggest in hindsight. The Maryland campaign continued to unfold through friction. McClellan moved with the knowledge he had gained, but Lee's army did not simply collapse because one order had been found. The campaign now pushed toward the mountain barrier west of Frederick, toward the roads that crossed South Mountain, toward the urgent Confederate effort against Harper's Ferry, and toward the eventual concentration near Sharpsburg. That is what makes the Lost Order so compelling. It is not a simple story of a mistake instantly punished. It is a story of opportunity partially seized, of danger recognized, of time racing faster than certainty. It reveals how close the campaign came to taking another shape, and how even extraordinary intelligence could not remove the brutal work still ahead. On September 9th, Special Orders No. 191 had helped direct a Confederate army in motion. On September 13th, wrapped in an envelope with 2 cigars, a copy placed that motion before McClellan. Between those 2 dates, Lee's Maryland gamble remained alive. After them, it became more perilous. The Union Army had a clearer view of the Confederate design, and the roads of western Maryland began to matter with new urgency. The paper had been found. The moment had opened. Now the armies would move toward South Mountain, while Harper's Ferry waited under the pressure of the campaign's design. The lost order had revealed the path. It had not yet determined the outcome. The lost order had revealed the path. It had not yet determined the outcome. That distinction mattered. A document could expose Lee's design, but it could not move an army by itself. It could not clear the roads. It could not seize the heights. It could not force separated Confederate commands to remain separated long enough for McClellan to destroy them. After September 13, 1862, the Maryland campaign entered a new and urgent phase, one defined not by paper in a field, but by time, distance, and the hard geography of western Maryland. The Union Army now had reason to move with purpose. Special Orders Number 191 had shown Confederate movements involving Martinsburg, Harpers Ferry, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. It revealed a campaign in motion, and it suggested that Lee's army was not gathered in one mass. The Army of Northern Virginia had been operating across a spread of towns and roads, with Harpers Ferry as one of the critical points in the Confederate design. For McClellan, this was an opportunity. For Lee, it was a danger. But opportunity in war is rarely clean. It arrives with uncertainty still attached to it. The order had been found on September 13th. The next day, September 14th, the Union Army fought the Battle of South Mountain. Then, on September 15th, Harper's Ferry fell to Confederate forces. These two events, so close together, formed the hinge between the discovery of Lee's plan and the bloodshed that would follow near Sharpsburg. South Mountain came first. On September 14, 1862, Union forces fought at South Mountain in Maryland. In the immediate story of Antietam, this battle is sometimes treated as a threshold, a hard passage between intelligence and contact. The roads that had mattered on the lost order now mattered in the physical sense. The Union Army was no longer simply reading Lee's campaign. It was pushing into it. The importance of South Mountain lies partly in its timing. It happened one day after McClellan received the lost order, and 3 days before the main battle along Antietam Creek. It was not an isolated collision. It was part of the same chain of events: Lee's invasion of Maryland, the division of Confederate movements around places like Harper's Ferry and Hagerstown, the accidental recovery of the operational order, and the Union effort to take advantage before the Confederate Army could fully concentrate. That is the quiet tension of these days. On September 13th, McClellan possessed a rare intelligence advantage. On September 14th, Union troops were in action at South Mountain. On September 15th, Confederate forces captured Harper's Ferry. By September 17th, the armies would face each other near Sharpsburg, and the battlefield landmarks of Antietam would begin to enter American memory. The calendar was compressed almost beyond belief. In less than a week, the campaign moved from secret orders to discovered orders, to mountain fighting, to the fall of a federal position, to the massing of two armies along a creek. What makes the sequence so important is that none of these events erased the others. The lost order did not prevent Harper's Ferry from falling. The Union fight at South Mountain did not stop Confederate forces from completing that part of Lee's operation. And the Confederate success at Harper's Ferry did not prevent Lee from having to take a defensive position near Sharpsburg. Instead, each event shaped the next, trying to provide the time you're in it. Harper's Ferry was central to the Confederate plan revealed in Special Orders Number 191. The order had outlined movements involving that place, along with Martinsburg, Boonesboro, and Hagerstown. Harper's Ferry sat under the pressure of Lee's campaign design before the armies ever met at Antietam. Its fall on September 15th gave the Confederates a victory within the wider Maryland campaign. It also affected the forces that would be available when the fighting shifted toward Sharpsburg. The consequences would be felt 2 days later. A.P. Hill's Confederate division was connected to the Harper's Ferry operation. On the day of the Battle of Antietam, Hill's troops would march approximately 15 miles from Harper's Ferry and arrive during the late-day phase. Their arrival would strike the Union left and help stop Burnside's final attack. That moment belongs later in the battle story, but its roots are here, in the fall of Harper's Ferry, and in the way Lee's army was being pulled back together after operating across the Maryland landscape. This is why Harper's Ferry cannot be treated as a side episode. It was not simply another place on the map. It was one of the mechanisms by which the battle near Sharpsburg took the shape it did. Confederate forces that had been engaged in the Harper's Ferry operation would matter at Antietam. The success there helped make possible the late arrival that would prevent a Union breakthrough from becoming a battlefield-ending rout. The same is true of South Mountain from the Union side. The battle on September 14th showed that the Army of the Potomac was closing the distance. The intelligence advantage had become movement. Movement had become contact. Contact was forcing decisions. Lee could not continue the Maryland campaign as though the lost order had never been found. McClellan could not turn discovery into victory without fighting through the terrain and the Confederate forces in front of him. Between South Mountain and Harper's Ferry, the campaign tightened. The wide operational map of the previous days began to contract toward Sharpsburg. Names that had appeared in the order as points of movement began to give way to the more intimate geography of a battlefield: creek, ridge, field, road, bridge, church, farm. The armies were still maneuvering, but they were maneuvering toward a place where maneuver would become slaughter. There is a powerful contradiction in these days before Antietam. The Union Army had gained knowledge of Lee's design. Confederate forces, despite that danger, captured Harper's Ferry. The Union fought at South Mountain, yet Lee's army was not destroyed before it could take position. The campaign was exposed, pressured, and damaged, but not broken. The result was not a clean Union triumph in the days before Antietam. It was a convergence. By September 15th, Harper's Ferry had fallen. By then, the Maryland campaign had already been forced into a narrower space. Lee's first invasion of the North had become more dangerous for him, but it had not yet failed. McClellan had the initiative, but not the decisive result. The Confederate army had won at Harper's Ferry, but now had to concentrate against the Union army approaching from the east. That concentration would define what came next. Near Sharpsburg, Lee chose ground east of the town, with Antietam Creek in front of him and the Potomac River behind the wider campaign story. The landscape itself would now become a weapon and a trap. Hills, open fields, woodlots, farm roads, and stone bridges shaping where men could move, where artillery could fire, and where attacks would be forced into narrow approaches. The road from the lost order had passed through South Mountain. The pressure on Harper's Ferry had ended in Confederate success. Together, these events brought the armies toward the same small Maryland landscape. By September 17th, the war would no longer be measured by orders found in a field or by towns named in a campaign plan. It would be measured in the Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church, the Sunken Road, the Lower Bridge, and the final attack toward Sharpsburg. The scattered pieces of Lee's invasion were coming together. Antietam Creek was waiting. Antietam Creek was waiting. Not as a line on a campaign map now, and not as a name carried in reports, but as a real obstruction in the Maryland countryside. It ran through a landscape of farms, roads, ridges, woodlots, and stone crossings east of Sharpsburg. By the time the armies faced one another there, the ground had become more than scenery. It had become the structure of the coming battle. General Robert E. Lee chose defensive ground near Antietam Creek, east of Sharpsburg. His army had been battered by marching, separated by the demands of the campaign, and drawn back together after the fighting at South Mountain and the Confederate success at Harper's Ferry. The choice of position mattered, because Lee was not merely placing men in a field. He was using the land itself, the creek before him, the high ground, the open approaches, the farm lanes, the woods, and the bridges that controlled movement across water. On the Union side, Major General George B. McClellan and the Army of the Potomac approached from the east. Between McClellan's army and Lee's line lay Antietam Creek, a stream that could be crossed, but not everywhere, and not easily by thousands of men, horses, artillery pieces, ambulances, and supply wagons under the pressure of battle. In war, a creek can be small enough to seem ordinary in peacetime and still large enough to shape the fate of an army. At Antietam, the creek helped divide the field into sectors. It forced attention onto crossing points. It made bridges important. It turned simple movement into tactical decision. The landscape west of the creek rose toward Sharpsburg. That rise helped the Confederate position. The ground was not a single wall, and it was not an impregnable fortress. It was a set of advantages, uneven and fragile, but real. Fields gave artillery and infantry long views in some places. Woods concealed movement in others. Roads cut through farms and linked parts of the line. Certain places, ordinary before the battle, became anchors because armies needed visible points in a confusing rural landscape. A church, a cornfield, a sunken farm road, a stone bridge, a ridge beyond a crossing. The names would soon become inseparable from Antietam. To the north lay the ground around Miller's cornfield. Before the battle, it was agricultural land, part of a working countryside. On September 17, 1862, it became one of the most violent spaces in American military history. The importance of the cornfield was partly its location on Lee's left flank, where the first major Union attacks would fall at dawn. But it also mattered because of what it represented about the battlefield as a whole. This was not a battlefield made of forts and ramparts. It was a battlefield made from civilian land, suddenly converted into military geography. Near that northern sector stood the West Woods. Woodlots mattered in Civil War combat because they broke lines of sight and complicated control. A formation entering woods could lose cohesion. Commanders could struggle to see what was happening. Troops could be protected from view and then suddenly exposed at short range. At Antietam, the West Woods became one of the defining landmarks of the morning fight. Along with the cornfield and the Dunker Church, it formed part of the area where Lee's left would be tested first. The Dunker Church stood nearby, a modest religious building that would become one of the battle's most recognizable points. Its full story belongs to the fighting around the West Woods, but even before the first shots of the morning, its presence gave the northern field a strange moral contrast. A house of worship became a battlefield marker. A peaceful structure built by local German Baptist brethren would stand amid the movements of armies. The name Dunker came from the practice of full immersion baptism. In the military geography of Antietam, the church became a fixed point in the chaos, a landmark soldiers and commanders could use to orient themselves as the fighting moved through the northern fields and woods. South of that northern zone, the field bent toward the Confederate center. There, a farm road had worn down into the earth over time. Before the battle, it was a practical rural route. During the battle, it became a defensive position. Later, it would be known as Bloody Lane. The sunken road mattered because terrain does not need to be designed for war in order to become military architecture. Wagon use and time had lowered the roadbed below the surrounding ground. That gave defenders cover, turning an ordinary road into something like a trench before trench warfare had become the dominant image of later conflicts. In the center of Lee's line, Confederate soldiers used that road as a position from which they could resist Union attacks. The fighting there would begin later in the morning, after the battle had already torn through the northern fields, and it would leave the road with a name that remembered what the ground had become. Farther south, Antietam Creek again asserted itself. The most famous crossing in that sector was known in 1862 as the Rohrbach or Lower Bridge. Later memory would attach another name to it, Burnside Bridge. The bridge had been built in 1836 to connect Sharpsburg with Rohrersville. It was a practical stone structure made for movement through a farming region, not for glory. But in battle, its narrowness and its setting mattered. A bridge concentrates movement. Men cannot cross it in broad formations. Artillery, horses, and infantry must funnel through. The ground overlooking it gave defenders an advantage, and at Antietam, about 500 Confederate soldiers would hold the area above the lower bridge for nearly 3 hours against Burnside's Union troops. That delay would shape the Southern battle and influence the timing of the day's final phase. Here the geography created a pattern that would repeat across the field. The Union Army had numbers and pressure. The Confederate Army had position and interior lines around Sharpsburg. The creek, bridges, ridges, roads, and woods prevented the battle from becoming one single blow. Instead, it would unfold in pieces: left, center, south, and then a final push. Antietam's violence would not come from one clean collision, but from repeated attacks against different parts of Lee's line, each shaped by local terrain. Beyond the lower bridge lay the ground of the final attack sector. This southern and southeastern portion of the battlefield would matter late in the day, after Burnside's troops finally crossed and moved forward. The route toward Sharpsburg seemed to open the possibility of breaking Lee's line. But the campaign had not finished moving pieces onto the board. A.P. Hill's Confederate Division, coming from the Harpers Ferry operation after a hard march, would arrive in time to strike the Union left and help stop the advance. That moment belonged to the end of the battle, But the ground for it was already waiting. The crossings, the roads, the slopes, the space between the creek and Sharpsburg. This is why Lee's position near Antietam Creek cannot be understood only as a line on a map. It was a defensive system improvised from a rural landscape. To the north, fields and woods opened the way toward the Cornfield, the Westwoods, and the Dunker Church. In the center, the sunken road offered cover and became Bloody Lane. To the south, the lower bridge forced a crossing under pressure. Beyond it, the final attack sector offered both opportunity and danger, a place where a Union advance might become decisive, or where a late Confederate arrival might change the shape of the afternoon. Every landmark had a civilian life before it had a military meaning. Miller's cornfield was not planted to become a killing ground. The West Woods were not grown to become a tactical maze. The Dunker Church was not built to become an icon of battlefield memory. The sunken road was not worn down to become a defensive trench. The Rohrbach, or lower bridge, was not built in 1836 so that an army could be delayed there for hours. These places became famous because armies arrived and forced old purposes into new ones. That transformation is one of the quiet truths of Antietam. The battle did not descend onto empty ground. It entered a living landscape. Farms, roads, churches, bridges, and fields were already there, serving the routines of Washington County, Maryland. War did not create them, but war renamed them. After September 17th, the names would carry a different weight. And the ground also shaped the human cost. The National Park Service estimates casualties by the sectors that these landmarks define: about 8,200 in the cornfield, about 4,300 in the West Woods, about 5,400 at Bloody Lane, about 620 at Burnside Bridge, and about 3,200 in the final attack sector. Those figures are not just arithmetic. They show how the terrain organized violence. Each landmark became a container for loss. By the evening of September 16th, the field was set. Lee's army held its position near Sharpsburg, with Antietam Creek before much of the Union approach. McClellan's army stood ready to attack. The campaign that had moved through Maryland was now compressed into a few miles of contested ground. The first great test would come on Lee's left. Before the center became Bloody Lane, before the lower bridge became Burnside Bridge, before the final attack toward Sharpsburg rose and failed in the late daylight, the morning would begin in the north. There, in the gray edge of dawn, Union attacks would move toward Miller's cornfield, the West Woods, and the white landmark of the Dunker Church. The landscape Lee had chosen was about to reveal its price. The landscape Lee had chosen was about to reveal its price. In the half-light of September 17, 1862, the northern end of the Antietam battlefield became the first great chamber of combat. The National Park Service places this opening phase, the cornfield fighting, from about 5:30 in the morning to about 9:30 in the morning. 4 hours. A span short enough to fit inside an ordinary morning, yet long enough to transform farms, woods, and a country church into some of the most remembered ground of the Civil War. The battle did not begin across the entire field at once. It opened against Lee's left flank, where Union attacks pressed toward Miller's cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunker Church area. These were not abstract positions on a staff map. They were parts of a lived-in rural landscape near Sharpsburg in Washington County, Maryland. Fields had been planted. Roads connected farms and families. Woodlots marked property and terrain. A church stood as a local landmark. But on this morning, those ordinary features became military objectives, lines of approach, places of cover, and points of deadly concentration. This is one of the central truths of Antietam. The battle's violence cannot be separated from its ground. The same terrain that had seemed useful to Lee as a defensive position now shaped the experience of the men sent into it. Open fields exposed movement. Woods broke formations and limited sight. Ridges and dips altered what commanders and soldiers could understand. Landmarks gave direction amid confusion, but they also drew fire and repeated assaults. The cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunker Church area became the first proof that this battlefield would not be decided by one clean stroke. The Union Army under Major General George B. McClellan was attacking a Confederate army under General Robert E. Lee that had come into Maryland as part of a gamble. That campaign had sought to shift the burden of war away from the South, threaten federal territory, possibly affect Northern politics, and encourage European recognition of the Confederacy. By dawn at Antietam, those ambitions had narrowed into the immediate problem of survival on chosen ground. Lee's first invasion of the North had brought him to Sharpsburg. Now McClellan's army was moving against him. At about 5:30 in the morning, the opening attacks struck the Confederate left. The National Park Service's timing matters because it reminds us that Antietam unfolded in phases, almost like pressure moving along a fault line. The northern fighting came first. Later, the center would be defined by the sunken road, which became Bloody Lane. Farther south, the lower bridge would draw its own deadly struggle. In the late afternoon, the final attack sector would carry the battle toward its last crisis. But before all of that, the morning belonged to the northern field. The name Miller's Cornfield has become inseparable from Antietam because it compresses the character of the battle into one plain phrase. It does not sound like a fortress. It does not sound like a place designed for war. It sounds agricultural, seasonal, local. And that is precisely why it is so powerful. The battle did not require a castle or a city wall to produce catastrophic loss. It required armies, weapons, command decisions, and ground that forced men into repeated contact. A cornfield could become a killing ground because the war had reached it. The West Woods and the Dunkerchurch area formed part of that same northern struggle. Together, they shaped the left flank fighting that opened the day. The woods offered cover, but not safety. The church provided a visible landmark, but not peace. In military terms, these places helped orient movement around Lee's left. In human terms, they marked how quickly a quiet landscape could be absorbed into the machinery of battle. The scale of loss in this first phase is difficult to hold in the mind, and so the numbers must be handled with care. The National Park Service estimates about 8,200 casualties in the Cornfield sector. That figure includes killed, wounded, missing, or captured. It is not the total for the whole battlefield. It is one sector in one morning in a battle that would continue for roughly 12 hours and become the bloodiest single day in American military history. The number does not need embellishment. It is already enough. About 8,200 casualties means that the opening hours of Antietam were not a preliminary skirmish. They were a major disaster in themselves. Before the center road acquired the name Bloody Lane, before Burnside's troops fought for the lower crossing, before A.P. Hill's division arrived from the Harpers Ferry operation late in the day, the northern field had already consumed thousands of men. The battle's terrible reputation was being made before mid-morning. What gives this phase its particular weight is the way it sits between the larger campaign and the later meaning of the war. Only days earlier, movements through Maryland had revolved around South Mountain, Harpers Ferry, and the consequences of Special Orders No. 191. The armies had maneuvered through towns, gaps, roads, and river crossings. Intelligence, speed, and concentration had shaped the approach to Sharpsburg. But at dawn on September 17th, the campaign entered its most brutal form. Planning became contact. Ground became consequence. And yet, even here, the battle did not become simple. Antietam is often described as tactically inconclusive, and the morning fighting helps explain why. Terrible force could be spent without producing a final decision. Men could be driven into the cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunkerchurch area. Casualties could rise by the thousands, and still, the Confederate army would not be destroyed in those first hours. Violence and decision were not the same thing. Antietam would prove that again and again across the day. That contradiction is central to understanding why the battle mattered. On the field, it did not deliver the clean annihilation of Lee's army. But strategically, it ended his first invasion of the North. Politically, it helped give President Abraham Lincoln the moment he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. The morning in the cornfield was part of that larger turn, but the men in that sector were not fighting inside a future textbook. They were fighting through terrain that had become immediate, physical, and lethal. The National Park Service's 4-hour frame, from about 5:30 in the morning to about 9:30 in the morning, also reminds us how compressed the violence was. The day was still young when the opening sector had already produced a casualty estimate larger than many entire battles. Time at Antietam did not move evenly. A few hours could carry the weight of years of national crisis. A farm field could gather the consequences of secession, invasion, military ambition, political uncertainty, and slavery's deepening place at the center of the war. The scene also establishes the pattern of the day. Union pressure would fall against different parts of Lee's line, not as one seamless blow, but as a series of violent phases. The left flank in the morning, the center later, the southern crossing and final attack after that. Each phase would be tied to a landmark. Each landmark would become a name in American memory. But this first phase showed how the battle would function: terrain channeling men, assaults meeting defense, losses rising faster than decision. By about 9:30 in the morning, the focus of the battle was beginning to shift. But the northern ground remained haunted by what had happened there. Miller's cornfield had become more than a farm feature. The West Woods had become more than a stand of trees. The Dunker Church area had become more than a point of reference near Lee's left. Together, they marked the opening wound of Antietam. The white church near the woods now draws the eye because of the contrast it carries. It belonged to a community of faith, not war. It had been built before the battle and stood within the local world that the armies entered and overwhelmed. Around it, the fighting on Lee's left became fierce enough that the Westwood sector alone would later be counted by the National Park Service at about 4,300 casualties. That quiet landmark and the woods beside it would hold the next part of the morning's story. That quiet landmark and the woods beside it would hold the next part of the morning's story. On the Antietam battlefield, the Dunker Church is remembered partly because it seems so small against the scale of what happened around it. It was not a fortress. It was not a headquarters. It was not built for command, defense, or military ceremony. It was a plain meeting house, standing near the West Woods, close to the northern ground where Lee's left flank absorbed the first great violence of September 17, 1862. Its presence matters because it reminds us what this landscape had been before the armies arrived. Before it became a battlefield, this was a rural Maryland neighborhood of farms, roads, woodlots, and local institutions. The church belonged to the German Baptist Brethren, a religious community whose nickname, Dunkers, came from their practice of full immersion baptism. The name itself carried the mark of belief and ritual, not war. The building had been erected in 1852, a decade before Antietam, on land donated in 1851 by Samuel Mumma. Those dates place the church inside the ordinary life of the community before the battle. Samuel Mumma's land donation was not made for a battlefield monument. It was made for worship. The congregation built a house of faith in a landscape where families worked nearby farms and gathered according to their convictions. By the time the Civil War reached Sharpsburg, that meeting house had already stood for 10 years. It had watched seasons pass. It had seen local roads used by neighbors rather than armies. It had existed in the slower time of rural life. Then, on the morning of Antietam, that slower time was broken. The battle on Lee's left had already surged through Miller's cornfield and the surrounding northern ground. The National Park Service places the cornfield fighting from about 5:30 in the morning to about 9:30 in the morning, and in the previous part of the story, that time frame gave us a way to measure the pace of violence. But near the Dunker Church and the West Woods, the geography of the battlefield created another grim concentration. Here, trees, open ground, ridges, and roads turned a quiet landmark into one of the most recognizable military reference points of the day. The West Woods stood near the church as part of the northern battlefield's broken terrain. In a campaign map, a woodlot can look simple: a patch of shade, a block of cover, an edge to be crossed or held. On the ground, it was more complicated. Woods could conceal movement, but they could also confuse units. They could protect men from sight, but not from artillery and close-range fire. They could offer a place to rally, or a place where formations lost contact and direction. Around Antietam, where open fields met stands of timber, the transition between one kind of ground and another became deadly. The Dunker Church made that confusion visible. It gave soldiers and commanders a reference point near Lee's left, a white structure that could be named in reports and remembered afterward. But the building did not control events. It stood inside them. The armies fought around it because of the larger shape of the field, because Lee's left had to be pressed, because Union attacks were trying to break through, and because Confederate defenders were trying to hold a position that protected the road to Sharpsburg and the army behind it. That is one of the recurring truths of Antietam. The landmarks we remember were often not important because of what they had been designed to do. The cornfield was not planted to become a killing ground. The sunken road had not been worn down by wagon traffic so that it could become Bloody Lane. The Rohrbach, or Lower Bridge, had not been built in 1836 to become Burnside Bridge, and the Dunker Church had not been raised in 1852 so that armies could navigate toward it through smoke and fire. War changed the meaning of ordinary places by forcing them into military use. For the German Baptist Brethren, the church represented a peaceful religious presence. Their name, rooted in full immersion baptism, pointed toward a community defined by faith and practice. In the broader story of Antietam, that fact gives the church its haunting contrast. A plain house of worship became a landmark in one of the bloodiest sections of the bloodiest single day in American military history. The contrast is not decorative. It is central to understanding the battle's human scale. Antietam was not fought on an empty board. It unfolded through inhabited ground. The West Woods sector shows how severe that unfolding became. The National Park Service estimates about 4,300 casualties in the West Woods sector alone. That figure is not the total for the battle. It is not even the total for the northern fighting. It is one sector, one part of the morning struggle near Lee's left. But it tells us what the name West Woods came to carry after the battle. A place that had once been identified by trees became a place measured by the thousands of men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The number is hard to hold in the mind. About 4,300 casualties means that the violence around those woods exceeded the population of many small communities. It means that, within a relatively confined portion of rural Maryland, the morning produced losses large enough to alter regiments, brigades, families, and towns far beyond Sharpsburg. The woods were local. The consequences were national. This is why the Dunker Church and the West Woods remain joined in memory. The church gives the scene a fixed point, a human scale, a visible sign of what had been there before. The woods give the scene depth and concealment, a sense of how the battle swallowed men into terrain that could not be easily controlled. Together, they show how Antietam's northern phase was not a single clean advance or a single dramatic reversal. It was a sequence of violent movements through fields and trees, with units entering ground that had already been torn by earlier fighting, and then adding their own losses to it. The battle's larger result would be described as tactically inconclusive. Lee's army would not be destroyed on the field. McClellan would not turn the intelligence advantage of the lost order and the pressure of the Maryland campaign into the complete annihilation of the Army of Northern Virginia. Yet here, around the Dunker Church and the West Woods, the phrase tactically inconclusive can feel almost inadequate. It explains the outcome at the level of armies. It does not soften the cost at the level of ground. For the men who fought there, the question was not whether historians would later call the day a decisive battlefield victory. The question was whether a line would hold, whether a formation could move, whether the next patch of woods or open field could be crossed or defended. The strategic meaning of Antietam would come into focus later. Lee's first invasion of the North ended, and Abraham Lincoln found the political and military opening to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. But the road to that consequence passed through places like this, where a church built for worship stood beside woods counted in casualties. The power of the Dunker Church as a battlefield landmark comes from that compression. In one view, there is local religion, immigrant-rooted community life, Samuel Mumma's donation of land in 1851, and the building completed by the German Baptist Brethren in 1852. In another view, there is the fierce fighting around Lee's left, the wider Union effort to break the Confederate position, and the National Park Service estimate of about 4,300 casualties in the West Woods sector. Both views are true. The tragedy is that, on September 17th, they occupied the same ground. By late morning, the northern battlefield had already paid a terrible price. The Cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunker Church area formed a chain of memory across Lee's left. Each landmark carried a different kind of meaning. The Cornfield spoke of agricultural land turned into a combat zone. The woods spoke of movement, concealment, and loss. The church spoke of peace, surrounded by violence. And just beyond this same world of local farms and religious landmarks stood another civilian place, about to enter the battle's story. The Mumma name had already appeared in the history of the church through Samuel Mumma's donation of land. But the Mumma farm itself would become one of the clearest examples of how civilian property was pulled directly into military necessity. As the fighting expanded across the landscape, even a family home could become part of the calculations of war. As the fighting expanded across the landscape, even a family home could become part of the calculations of war. The Mumma farm stood inside that world of ordinary places, overtaken by extraordinary violence. It was not famous because a general made his headquarters there, or because a bridge or road forced armies into a narrow passage. Its meaning is quieter than that. It was a civilian farm, part of the rural community around Sharpsburg, Maryland, close enough to the northern fighting that it became militarily important simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong hour. The name had already appeared near the Dunker Church. Samuel Mumma had donated land for that meeting house in 1851 before the local German Baptist Brethren built it in 1852. That connection matters because it reminds us that these battlefield landmarks were not isolated dots on a military map. They belonged to families, congregations, neighbors, and fields worked before anyone imagined that the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia would collide there. By September 17, 1862, that civilian geography had been absorbed into a military one. The roads, ridges, farm lanes, orchards, woodlots, barns, houses, fences, and fields around Sharpsburg were no longer only the features of a working countryside. They had become positions, obstacles, cover, approaches, and lines of sight. Commanders looked at the same land differently from those who lived on it. A house could be shelter. A barn could block a view. A fence could slow a formation. A field could expose men to fire. A road could guide an attack. A farmstead could become a threat if it offered a place for enemy soldiers to fire from. That was the logic that reached the Mumma farm. Confederate soldiers deliberately burned the farm to prevent its use by Union sharpshooters. In that fact, the war becomes immediate and hard to look away from. The burning was not an accident of shell fire described afterward as fate. It was a decision made inside the military pressures of the battle. The concern was practical. If Union sharpshooters used the buildings, they could threaten Confederate positions nearby. The solution was destructive. Remove the buildings from the field of possible use. It is a small sentence in the record, but it carries the weight of the entire campaign. Lee's army had crossed into Maryland with strategic hopes that reached far beyond Sharpsburg. The campaign was meant to shift the war away from the South, threaten federal territory, possibly influence Northern politics, and encourage European recognition of the Confederacy. McClellan's army had come after it, moving through the chain of events that included South Mountain and Harpers Ferry. By the time the armies settled into combat along Antietam Creek, those broad strategic ambitions had narrowed into immediate choices made at fences, lanes, farms, and houses. The Mumma farm shows that narrowing grand strategy became fire set to civilian property. The Mumma family had fled before the battle. That detail changes the way the burning is felt. The farm was not burned around a family still inside it. The Mummas had already left the path of the armies. But absence did not protect their home. Flight could save lives, but it could not carry away buildings, crops, memories, or the physical structure of a family's labor. The battlefield remained behind them, and their property remained inside it. This was one of the terrible realities for civilians in a war fought across settled land. The armies did not enter empty space. They entered communities. Around Sharpsburg, the features that shaped combat had names because they belonged to people. Miller's Cornfield was a farm field before it became a phrase associated with mass casualties. The Dunker Church was a meeting house before it became a landmark in the fighting on Lee's left. The Sunken Road was a rural road before it became Bloody Lane. The Lower Bridge was built in 1836 to connect Sharpsburg with Rohrersville before it became known to later generations as Burnside Bridge. The Mumma farm belongs in that same pattern. Its destruction was not separate from the battle. It was one of the ways the battle used the land. To say that Confederate soldiers burned it to prevent Union sharpshooters from using it is also to see how the battlefield was being read in real time. Sharpshooters needed positions. Buildings could provide them. A farmstead could offer elevation, concealment, or protection. What a family might have understood as home could be interpreted by soldiers as a dangerous advantage. In that moment, the human meaning of the place did not disappear, but it was overruled by military necessity. That phrase, military necessity, can sound abstract. The Mumma farm makes it physical. It means wood and brick and household space altered by force. It means that the presence of a structure on a contested field could be enough to mark it for destruction. It means that the boundary between civilian life and battle was not a clean line. It was porous, unstable, and often decided by whoever held a match, a torch, or an order in the path of advancing armies. The family's absence also helps us understand the battlefield as more than a scene of soldierly suffering. Antietam is rightly remembered for the scale of military casualties. In roughly 12 hours of combat, more than 22,000 men were killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The National Park Service estimates the violence in sectors that have become familiar by name: about 8,200 casualties in the Cornfield, about 4,300 in the West Woods, about 5,400 at Bloody Lane, about 620 at Burnside Bridge, and about 3,200 in the final attack sector. Those numbers are essential because they show the human cost borne by the armies. But the Mumma farm asks the listener to widen the frame without losing focus. It reminds us that the soldiers fought through a lived-in landscape. The battle damaged not only bodies and regiments, but the material world that civilians depended on. Farms were not scenery. They were homes, livelihoods, inheritance, and community. When the battle ended, civilians returned not to an unchanged countryside, but to ground marked by combat and loss. The Mummas rebuilt in 1863. That fact is important because it prevents the story from ending only in destruction. Rebuilding does not erase the burning, and it does not make the loss simple. But it does show that life returned to the battlefield in practical, determined ways. The family came back into a landscape that had been made nationally famous by violence and began again. In the same year that the final Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863, and the war's meaning continued to change, a family whose farm had been pulled into the battle was rebuilding on the ground where that battle had passed. There is a quiet power in that contrast. Antietam helped create the political and military opening for Abraham Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. The battle became part of the transformation of the Civil War itself, from a struggle to preserve the Union into a war also aimed at destroying slavery. At the same time, on the local level, the aftermath involved fences, farms, damaged buildings, and families returning to what remained. National turning points are lived through in ordinary places. The Mumma farm helps hold those scales together. It connects the vast consequences of Antietam to the smaller geography of a household. It shows how the same battlefield could be a strategic turning point, a military catastrophe, a photographic shock to the public, a medical emergency, and a civilian disaster. None of those meanings cancels the others. They overlap on the same ground. By late morning, the fighting on Lee's left had already carved deep memory into the northern end of the field. The Cornfield had become a place of repeated attack and counterattack. The West Woods had become another measure of the battle's cost. The Dunker Church stood as a plain, religious landmark surrounded by violence. The Mumma farm, deliberately burned, added a different kind of testimony, that homes and farms could be drawn directly into the tactical needs of armies. From there, the center of the battlefield comes into view. South and west of these northern landmarks, another ordinary feature of rural life was about to be transformed by combat. It was a farm road, worn down by use, sunken into the ground. Before the day was over, that road would carry a new name, one that fixed the cost of the fighting into the landscape itself: Bloody Lane. From the burned farm and the quiet church, the eye moves toward the center of the Antietam battlefield. The landscape does not become less ordinary there. It becomes, if anything, more ordinary. No great river crossing dominates the view. No large town street marks the line. The place that would become one of the defining images of the battle began as a simple farm road. It was worn down by use, pressed below the level of the surrounding ground. In the language of the field, it was the sunken road. After September 17, 1862, memory gave it another name: Bloody Lane. The power of that name comes from the transformation. A road built for movement became a position for defense. A feature meant to connect farms and fields became a barrier. Men who might have passed along it in peacetime now used its lowered banks as protection. The shape of the land gave the road a trench-like quality, not because it had been designed as a fortification, but because ordinary rural use had slowly cut it into the earth. At Antietam, terrain repeatedly turned the battle. The creek, the hills, the open fields, the woods, the bridges, and the farm lanes all shaped what soldiers could see, where they could move, and how long they could hold. The sunken road mattered because it offered Confederate troops in the center something the open field did not, a defensive position already built into the ground. The National Park Service places the fighting in the Bloody Lane sector from about 9:30 in the morning to about 1 in the afternoon. That timing matters. By then, the northern end of the field had already endured hours of violence around Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, and the Dunker Church. The battle had not paused so much as shifted its weight. The morning's force moved from Lee's left toward his center, and the sunken road became the next place where the armies collided. In a battle that lasted roughly 12 hours, 3.5 hours in one sector can sound almost brief. But at Antietam, time compressed. A few hours could mean thousands of casualties. The National Park Service estimates about 5,400 casualties in the Bloody Lane sector alone. That number is not just a statistic attached to a place. It is a measure of how a narrow piece of ground could absorb the pressure of repeated combat. The road became deadly because it combined protection and exposure. For defenders, the sunken path offered cover and a stable line. It allowed Confederate forces in the center to resist attacks that moved against them over the surrounding ground. But the same road that helped them hold also fixed them in place. A defensive position can become a trap when the pressure grows too great, when movement is limited, and when the ground that once protected men begins to collect the full force of battle. For attackers, the sunken road represented the kind of obstacle that appears simple from a distance and terrible up close. It was not a stone fortress. It was not a high wall. It was a farm road cut into Maryland soil. Yet to cross ground under fire toward a position like that was to discover how much violence could be concentrated by a shallow depression in the landscape. This is one reason Bloody Lane became such a lasting image of defensive combat. It showed that the Civil War battlefield did not always require elaborate fortifications to become devastating. The armies could turn a road, a fence line, a woodlot, or a bridge into the center of a killing ground. At Antietam, the farm landscape itself became military architecture. The name Bloody Lane also carries a later understanding of the place. During the battle, it was the sunken road. Its older name described its physical form. Its later name described what the fighting made of it. That shift in language is important. The battlefield was not only fought over, it was renamed by what happened there. Places that once had practical meanings acquired moral and emotional ones. Cornfields, woods, churches, farms, bridges, and roads became markers of national memory. The fighting in the center also helps explain why Antietam could be tactically inconclusive and still strategically immense. No single sector ended the battle outright. The Union attacks did not destroy Lee's army. The Confederate defense did not drive McClellan completely from the field. Instead, the battle unfolded as a series of violent contests across separate but connected parts of the landscape. The left, the center, and the south each had their own timing, their own geography, and their own cost. Bloody Lane was central not only in location, but in meaning. It revealed the difficulty of breaking a defended line, even when the defending army was under enormous pressure. It also showed the limits of endurance. A position could hold for hours and still become a scene of collapse, loss, and exhaustion. Defensive ground gave advantages, but it did not remove vulnerability. It concentrated the fight until the human cost became impossible to separate from the land itself. The casualty estimate of about 5,400 in this sector stands beside the other terrible measures of the day, about 8,200 in the Cornfield, about 4,300 in the West Woods, about 620 at Burnside Bridge, and about 3,200 in the final attack sector. Each number belongs to a different part of the field, but together they explain why Antietam is remembered as the bloodiest single day in American military history. Here in the center, the number is attached to a road. That is what makes the scene so stark. The sunken road had no grand design behind it. It was not constructed for a national crisis. It did not represent strategy on a map. It was an everyday path through agricultural country near Sharpsburg, Maryland. And yet, for several hours on September 17, 1862, it became one of the most important defensive positions on the field. To understand Bloody Lane is to understand how Antietam turned local geography into national consequence. The armies had come into Maryland through a campaign shaped by large ambitions, shifting the war away from the South, threatening federal territory, influencing Northern politics, and perhaps encouraging European recognition of the Confederacy. But on the day of battle, those ambitions were reduced to physical ground. A cornfield, a church, a farm, a road. The sunken road reminds us that war often changes meaning at close range. Campaign plans and political hopes still mattered, but soldiers in the center of the field faced something more immediate: the bank of a road, the slope of the ground, the line held in front of them, the fire coming toward them. The large history of Antietam passed through these small places. By early afternoon, the fighting in the Bloody Lane sector had added another defining image to the battlefield. The road that once carried farm traffic had become a symbol of defensive combat under extreme pressure. Its new name did not explain the whole battle, but it captured one of its central truths. At Antietam, ordinary ground became unforgettable because of what armies did there. And while the center burned through its hours of combat, another struggle was taking shape farther south. There, Antietam Creek and a narrow stone crossing would impose their own geometry on the battle. The bridge was known in 1862 as the Rohrbach, or Lower Bridge, built decades earlier to connect Sharpsburg with Rohrersville. Like the sunken road, it had been made for civilian movement. Like the sunken road, it was about to become a military problem measured in time, terrain, and lives. South of the sunken road, the battle narrowed again. After the long violence in the center, after the farm road that would be remembered as Bloody Lane, the field seemed to gather itself around another ordinary structure. This time it was not a road worn down by wagon traffic, but a bridge of stone over Antietam Creek. In 1862, it was known as the Rohrbach Bridge, or simply the Lower Bridge. Later, history would attach another name to it, Burnside Bridge. That later name can make the place sound as if it had always belonged to the battle. But it had not. Like so much of the Antietam landscape, the bridge began as a civilian answer to a local need. It was built in 1836 to connect Sharpsburg with Rohrersville. Before armies came into Washington County, Maryland, before the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia turned these farms and crossings into a battlefield, the bridge was part of movement through a rural world. It carried people, wagons, goods, and local traffic across Antietam Creek. Its purpose was connection. On September 17, 1862, that purpose was transformed. The same stone span that had linked communities became a choke point. The creek, the road, the bridge, and the ground above it all combined into a military problem. For Burnside's Union troops, the bridge was a passage that had to be forced. For the Confederate defenders, it was a place where a smaller force could use terrain to delay a much larger one. Here, the geometry of the battlefield mattered as much as numbers. In open ground, size could be brought to bear more directly. Men could be spread out, lines could extend, and pressure could be applied across a wider front. But a bridge changes that equation. A bridge compresses movement. It reduces an army's strength into a narrow point. However many soldiers stand behind the attack, only so many can cross at once. The mass of the force waits behind the leading edge, while the defenders focus attention on the crossing. At the lower bridge, about 500 Confederate soldiers held the overlooking area for nearly 3 hours against Burnside's Union troops. That fact is one of the clearest examples at Antietam of how favorable ground could magnify defensive power. 500 men could not stop an army everywhere. But they did not have to stop it everywhere. They had to hold a specific point for a specific time from ground that gave them an advantage. And time, on this battlefield, was not an abstract thing. Time was the currency of survival. Time allowed battered units elsewhere to hold on. Time prevented one part of the Union plan from connecting cleanly with another. Time gave Lee's army a chance to endure a day in which its lines had already been tested in the cornfield, around the West Woods and Dunkerchurch, and along the sunken road. The National Park Service places the Burnside Bridge fighting in the same broad middle portion of the day as the struggle at Bloody Lane, from about 9:30 in the morning to about 1 in the afternoon. That overlap matters. The battle was not a clean sequence in which one scene ended and another began. It was a series of violent pressures applied across different parts of Lee's position, some fading as others intensified, some consuming attention while others waited for opportunity. In the north, the morning had opened in the Cornfield and around the Dunker Church. In the center, the sunken road became Bloody Lane. In the south, the lower bridge held the Union left before Antietam Creek. From a distance, this can seem like a delay caused by a single obstacle. But the bridge was more than stone over water. It was part of a defensive landscape. The Confederate soldiers did not need to meet Burnside's men on equal terms in the open. They held the area, overlooking the crossing. That elevated relationship between defender and attacker gave the position its power. The bridge drew the attacking force toward a narrow place. The overlooking ground gave the defenders a field of control. This is one of the quiet lessons of Antietam. The battle was shaped not only by commanders and orders, but by structures built long before anyone imagined them as military objects. A church became a landmark for combat. A farm road became a defensive position. A family farm became a place calculated in terms of sharpshooters and fire. And here, a bridge built to connect Sharpsburg and Roarsville became a point where hundreds of men fought over minutes, yards, and access. The later name, Burnside Bridge, keeps the Union struggle at the crossing in memory. It connects the place to Burnside's troops and to the effort to move the Union left across Antietam Creek. But the earlier names, Rohrbach Bridge and Lower Bridge, are important because they restore the bridge to its pre-war identity. They remind us that this was not a monument when the soldiers approached it. It was infrastructure. It was local. It belonged to a lived landscape before it belonged to military history. That tension gives the site much of its meaning. The stone bridge had stood for more than 2 decades before the battle. It had weathered ordinary seasons. It had served the traffic of peace. Then, in the space of a single day, its value changed. The question was no longer who needed to reach Roarsville or Sharpsburg. The question was whether Union troops could cross in time to threaten Lee's right and change the shape of the battle before the day ran out. For nearly 3 hours, the Confederate defenders helped prevent that from happening. The casualty estimate for the Burnside Bridge sector is about 620. Compared with the staggering figures from the Cornfield, the West Woods, and Bloody Lane, the number is smaller. But that can be misleading if the bridge is judged only by the casualty count. Its significance also lies in delay. The fighting here shows how a relatively small defensive force could hold up a larger attacking force and influence the timing of an entire battlefield. At Antietam, timing was everything. Lee's army was under immense pressure. McClellan's forces had found opportunities, but turning those opportunities into decisive destruction required coordination across the field. A delay in one sector could change what was possible in another. A crossing force too late might still be brave, still costly, still tactically meaningful, but it could arrive after the best moment for exploitation had begun to pass. That is why the lower bridge belongs at the center of the battle's story, even though it sits in the southern portion of the field. It shows the battle as a contest of movement and obstruction. It shows how a small number of defenders, protected by position, could hold a narrow crossing long enough to shape the afternoon. And it shows how the Army of the Potomac's strength could be slowed by the physical facts of creek, bridge, and hillside. The image is almost deceptively simple. Union troops pressing toward a stone bridge, Confederate soldiers holding the ground above, Antietam Creek between them. But inside that image is the larger logic of the day. The battle was not one collision. It was a chain of collisions, each bound to the land beneath it. Men fought where roads dipped, where woods opened, where fields exposed them, where stone structures forced them into lines of approach. The lower bridge was one more ordinary place made decisive by the pressure of armies. By early afternoon, Burnside's troops had forced their way into the story of the southern field. The bridge that had delayed them could no longer fully contain what was coming. The Union left would move beyond the crossing, and the battle would enter its late-day phase, the period the National Park Service marks from about 3 in the afternoon to sunset. But the hours lost at the lower bridge could not be recovered. They had been spent under fire in the narrow passage between intention and achievement. And as Burnside's men pushed forward from the creek, another force was moving toward the field from the direction of the Harpers Ferry operation. A.P. Hill's Confederate division, after a march of approximately 15 miles, was approaching the Union left. The struggle at the bridge had opened the way south of Sharpsburg, but the day was not yet finished. The final attack was still ahead, and so was the last Confederate blow that would help keep Antietam from becoming the complete Union victory McClellan had sought. The crossing at the lower bridge had opened, but it had opened late. For hours, the southern end of the Antietam battlefield had been defined by delay, a narrow stone bridge, steep ground, and a small Confederate force able to hold the overlooking area while Burnside's Union troops struggled to get across Antietam Creek. By the time the Union left was ready to move beyond the bridge and toward Sharpsburg, the battle had already consumed the morning in the Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church area, and the Sunken Road. The day had not paused between those fights. It had simply shifted its weight across the landscape. Now, in the late afternoon, that weight settled on Burnside's advance. The National Park Service marks this final phase of the battle from about 3 in the afternoon to sunset. It was the last major movement of the day, and it carried a possibility that had been building since the bridge was taken. If Burnside's troops could press forward from the Union left, they might threaten the Confederate position near Sharpsburg. After the violence already endured across Lee's line, this southern pressure mattered. It was not merely another attack on another sector. It was the late-day chance to turn a hard-fought crossing into something larger. But the timing was everything. The same hours that had exhausted men at the bridge had also given the Confederate Army time to survive. Antietam was a battle of places, but it was also a battle of clocks. The Cornfield had its hours. Bloody Lane had its hours. Burnside Bridge had its hours. Each delay carried consequences into the next phase, and by the time the Union left moved forward, the afternoon was already narrowing. Sunset was no longer distant. The opportunity was real, but it was shrinking. Burnside's final attack pushed beyond Antietam Creek into the southern portion of the field. Behind his troops lay the bridge that had cost so much time to force. Ahead lay the Confederate right and the approaches toward Sharpsburg. The ground itself no longer held them in quite the same way the bridge had. The fight had opened out from the crossing, and with that opening came a different kind of pressure. The Union left was no longer trying simply to pass a choke point. It was trying to turn passage into momentum. For Lee's army, that was the danger. All day, the Army of Northern Virginia had fought under pressure from larger Union forces. The morning had battered Lee's left flank. The center had been torn at the Sunken Road. The southern line, held near the lower bridge by a much smaller Confederate force, had bought time. But once Burnside's troops came on, the question was whether the Confederate right could still hold long enough for the day to end. At this moment, a new force entered the story from outside the immediate battlefield. A.P. Hill's Confederate division was coming from the Harpers Ferry operation. Harpers Ferry had fallen to Confederate forces 2 days earlier on September 15, 1862, and that victory had shaped the concentration of troops that made Antietam possible. Now it shaped the battle again. Hill's men had marched approximately 15 miles on the day of the battle, moving toward the sound and urgency of the fighting near Sharpsburg. That detail matters because it places the final attack inside the larger campaign rather than inside a single field alone. Antietam was not isolated from South Mountain, Harpers Ferry, or the roads that bound the campaign together. The same Confederate operation that had captured Harpers Ferry now sent a division toward the endangered end of Lee's line. The battlefield was receiving the consequences of decisions made days earlier and miles away. Hill's arrival struck the Union left. For Burnside's troops, the appearance of this Confederate force changed the meaning of the afternoon. The advance that had seemed to promise a possible breakthrough now met a fresh danger on its flank. It was not enough to have crossed the creek. It was not enough to have forced the bridge. The Union left now had to absorb a counterblow at the very moment when its own attack needed cohesion, direction, and speed. The National Park Service estimates about 3,200 casualties in the final attack sector. That number belongs to the last phase of the day, but it also carries the accumulated burden of everything that came before it. By late afternoon, Antietam had already become the bloodiest single day in American military history. The final attack did not create that fact by itself. It completed it. It added one more field of loss to the Cornfield, the West Woods, Bloody Lane, and Burnside Bridge. The scale of the casualties also reminds us that the end of a battle is not necessarily a fading of violence. Sometimes the final hours are among the most desperate because commanders and soldiers can sense that the day is running out. There is still light enough to attack, but not enough time to recover from failure. There is still a chance to change the result, but the window is closing. At Antietam, Burnside's late advance carried that urgency. Hill's arrival carried the Confederate answer. The result was not the complete Union victory that might have followed a successful collapse of Lee's right. Hill's division helped stop Burnside's advance, and with that, the final Union push of the day lost its chance to decide the field outright. Lee's army remained battered, but not destroyed. McClellan's army held the field but had not annihilated its opponent. The battle ended without the kind of clear tactical conclusion that battlefield maps often seem to promise, and yet the consequences were enormous. The final attack helps explain the central contradiction of Antietam. On the ground, the battle was tactically inconclusive. The Army of Northern Virginia was not destroyed at Sharpsburg. Lee's line had been struck again and again, but it had not fully broken. Burnside's late-day pressure might have forced something decisive, but A.P. Hill's march from the Harpers Ferry operation helped prevent that outcome. Still, the broader campaign turned. Lee's first invasion of the North came to an end after Antietam. The Confederate Army would withdraw back across the Potomac River into Virginia. For President Abraham Lincoln, the battle provided the political and military opening he had been waiting for. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. A battle that had ended without a clean tactical victory became the hinge for a new phase of the war. That is why the final attack sector cannot be treated as merely the last scene of a long day. It is the place where the chance of a decisive Union battlefield victory narrowed and closed. It is also the place where the Confederate Army's survival on the field did not prevent a strategic reversal. Hill's arrival helped save Lee's line from collapse, but it did not preserve the Maryland campaign as Lee had hoped. Burnside's attack was stopped, but Lee's invasion was stopped as well. Antietam's final hours therefore hold two truths at once. On the battlefield, Confederate resistance prevented a Union breakthrough. In the larger war, the Union gained enough to claim a turning point. The field near Sharpsburg remained contested in memory because the fighting itself had been so costly and the result so complex. The armies had not produced a simple ending. They had produced a new beginning at terrible cost. As sunset approached on September 17, 1862, the firing diminished across a landscape that had been transformed from farms, roads, woods, bridges, and church ground into a chain of casualty sectors. The final attack had added its own toll, about 3,200 casualties to the day's already staggering total. The Union left had advanced. A.P. Hill's division had arrived after its long march. The Confederate right had held. The last major blow of the battle had been delivered, and the armies remained facing one another near Sharpsburg. But the work of the day did not end when the firing slowed. Commanders still needed information. Staff officers still moved across roads and ridges. The wounded still lay across fields that had only hours earlier been tactical objectives. Behind the lines, another kind of battlefield had been taking shape throughout the day, one made of headquarters, messages, medical decisions, and improvised care. To understand how the Army tried to manage Antietam while it was happening, the eye has to move away from the final firing lines and back across Antietam Creek. There, near Keedysville, a brick house stood on a rise on the east bank. Built by Philip Pry in 1844, with bricks fired on the property, it had become more than a private home. During the battle, the Pry House served as Union headquarters for George B. McClellan and as the headquarters for the Army of the Potomac Medical Department under Dr. Jonathan Letterman. From that rise, the battle could be directed, observed, and, in another sense, measured. By the time the firing slackened towards sunset, Antietam had become more than a line of separate attacks. It was a field of decisions, delays, reports, and consequences, spread across farms, roads, bridges, woods, and ridges. The combat had moved from the Cornfield to the West Woods, from the sunken road to the lower bridge, from Burnside's advance to the sudden arrival of A.P. Hill's men. But behind that visible movement was another geography of the battle, quieter and no less important, the places from which the Union Army tried to understand what was happening. One of those places stood near Keedysville, on the east bank of Antietam Creek. The Pry House was not built for war. Philip Pry built it in 1844 using bricks fired on the property. That detail matters because it returns the building to its original scale. Before it became a headquarters, before messages and medical decisions moved through it, it was a home made from the material of its own land. The bricks came from the place itself. The rise beneath it was part of the same Maryland landscape of fields, creek banks, farm lanes, and family properties that the armies had entered during the Maryland campaign. Yet on September 17, 1862, that private house became part of the machinery of a national crisis. The Pry House stood on a rise on the east bank of Antietam Creek, across from the battlefield ground near Sharpsburg. From that height, it occupied a different position from the farms that had been swallowed by the combat. It was not the Cornfield, where the morning attacks had torn through Lee's left. It was not the West Woods or the Dunker Church, where a peaceful landmark had become a point of reference in a violent struggle. It was not the sunken road, where a farm lane became a defensive position, and then Bloody Lane. It was not the lower bridge, where the shape of the creek and the bridge controlled time itself. The Pry House was a place of command. During the battle, it served as Union headquarters for Major General George B. McClellan. That meant the house and its surrounding ground became part of the way the Army of the Potomac attempted to direct a battlefield too large, too smoky, and too chaotic to be held fully in one mind. Antietam was fought across a landscape of separated sectors, and those sectors did not unfold in a clean sequence for the men trying to manage them. Reports arrived from one part of the field, while another part was already changing. The fighting in the northern sector had begun around dawn. The center had become decisive by late morning. The southern portion had been delayed for hours at the bridge, and the final attack had stretched from about 3 in the afternoon to sunset. From the rise near Keedysville, Union command had to turn that violence into information. That is the quiet tension of a headquarters in battle. It is not silent. It is not calm in any simple sense. But it is removed from the immediate act of firing. Men at headquarters deal in fragments, messages, sightings, estimates, orders, appeals, and uncertainties. A commander can possess maps, staff officers, couriers, and a commanding position and still be separated from the living reality of the fight by distance, terrain, smoke, time, and fear. Antietam had already shown how deeply terrain could shape action. The creek, the fields, the bridges, the hills, and the farm roads had not simply provided a backdrop. They had controlled movement, slowed attacks, protected defenders, and scattered the battle into parts. At the Pry House, McClellan's headquarters stood on the Union side of Antietam Creek, east of the waterway that gave the battle its name. This location placed it behind the Union lines, close enough to the field to function as a center of direction, but not within the same physical immediacy as the killing grounds west of the creek. That position helps explain the dual nature of headquarters work. From there, the battle could be observed and directed, but it could also be misunderstood, delayed, or reduced to reports that lagged behind events. A headquarters does not erase confusion. It organizes confusion into decisions. The Pry House also carried another responsibility during the battle. It served as headquarters for the Army of the Potomac Medical Department under Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. That pairing is essential. The same property associated with command was also associated with medical administration. At Antietam, the direction of armies and the care of bodies were not separate stories. They occupied the same landscape. The decisions that sent men forward and the systems that tried to treat them afterward belonged to the same day, the same army, and in this case, the same headquarters environment. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's presence at the Pry property points toward a different kind of military problem. Battles are often narrated through attacks and counterattacks, advances and retreats, victories and failures. But every one of those movements creates another set of demands: evacuation, treatment, supplies, surgeons, field hospitals, and the constant question of how to respond when thousands of men have been wounded in a matter of hours. Antietam produced more than 22,000 casualties in a single day. No headquarters, no hospital system, and no individual physician could make that fact manageable in any ordinary sense. But the Army still had to try. That is why the Pry House matters as more than a backdrop for McClellan. It marks the point where the battle's command structure and its medical response came into close contact. On the rise above the east bank of Antietam Creek, the Union Army was not only trying to decide how to fight, it was also beginning to confront what the fighting had done. The house itself, built less than 2 decades earlier, was part of a civilian world transformed by military necessity. Philip Pry could not have built it in 1844, knowing that, in 1862, it would become a headquarters in the bloodiest single day in American military history. Its bricks, fired on the property, belonged to a local story of construction and permanence. War gave them another meaning. The building became a place where the wider conflict entered a private home and changed its function, if not its structure. The rise that had once offered a view over ordinary countryside now offered a view into a divided nation's struggle. There's a powerful contrast in that image. Across Antietam Creek, the landmarks of combat had been made famous by violence: the Cornfield, the Westwoods, Bloody Lane, Burnside Bridge. At the Pry House, the drama was less visible, but still central. Orders moved. Information gathered. Medical organization took shape. The house became part of the hidden architecture of the battle, a place where the Union Army tried to impose sequence and purpose on a day that had resisted both. McClellan's presence there also reminds us of Antietam's larger contradiction. The battle did not destroy Lee's army. It did not produce the complete battlefield result that Union leaders might have hoped for. And yet it ended Lee's first invasion of the North and created the political and military opening Abraham Lincoln needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later, on September 22, 1862. The decisions made around Antietam, including those shaped at headquarters, belong to that larger consequence. What happened on the fields near Sharpsburg did not remain only a military event. It helped force a new direction in the war. But before that meaning could fully emerge, there were bodies to be gathered and wounds to be treated. The Pry House rise gives us a way to pause between the battlefield and the aftermath. From the firing lines, we have followed the combat through its main phases. From this headquarters, we begin to see the other battle that Antietam created, the struggle to care for men broken by the day's violence. Under Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Army of the Potomac Medical Department used the Pry property as a center of medical authority. Around it, barns and farms became places of treatment. The same rural landscape that had shaped the fighting now had to absorb the wounded. The guns had made Antietam one kind of battlefield. The hospitals would make it another. The guns had made Antietam one kind of battlefield. The hospitals would make it another. From the rise of the Pry House, the landscape looked different after the firing stopped. The same farms, lanes, barns, and fields that had shaped the movement of armies now had to receive the human cost of those movements. During the day, commanders had watched for openings, for gaps, for the arrival of reinforcements, for the chance that one more attack might decide the field. Afterward, the question changed. It was no longer how to move men into battle. It was how to carry them away from it, how to sort the living from the dying, how to bring some order to suffering spread across miles of rural Maryland. The Pry property had already been drawn into the machinery of command. The brick house near Keedysville, built by Philip Pry in 1844 with bricks fired on the property, had served as Union headquarters for George B. McClellan. It had also become the headquarters for the Army of the Potomac Medical Department under Dr. Jonathan Letterman. That second function now became central. As the reports of combat gave way to the realities of the wounded, the Pry House and the ground around it stood at the edge of a different kind of campaign. The Pry Barn became one of the places where that campaign was fought. In ordinary times, a barn belonged to the rhythm of farm life: storage, animals, tools, harvest, weather. At Antietam, it became part of an emergency medical system, trying to answer a catastrophe larger than any single building could contain. Nearby farms were drawn into the same work. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine states that at least 1,500 men were treated at the Pry Barn, the R.F. Kennedy Farm, and the Henry Neekirk farm sites. That number matters because it gives scale to what otherwise can disappear into a general phrase like the wounded. At least 1,500 men treated not in a permanent hospital built for war, but in and around farm buildings whose owners had known them as places of labor and home. These sites were not distant from the battle's meaning. They were part of it. The fighting at Antietam is often remembered by its terrible landmarks: the Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church, Bloody Lane, the Lower Bridge, the final attack sector. But after the lines shifted and the firing faded, the map of Antietam acquired another set of names: Pry, R.F. Kennedy, Henry Neikirk. These places tell us that the battle did not end at sunset in any simple human sense. It continued in the movement of stretcher bearers, in the search for water, in the demand for bandages, in the difficult labor of surgeons and assistants attempting to save men who had survived the field but not yet escaped its consequences. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's presence at the Pry property gives this aftermath a center. As medical director of the Army of the Potomac, he represented an effort to bring organization to the care of the wounded. Antietam tested that effort under extreme conditions. The Army of the Potomac had fought across a broad and broken field, and the casualties were scattered through places where the battle had surged and recoiled, near corn, woods, roads, bridges, ridges, and farmsteads. The medical response had to reach into that same landscape. It had to connect headquarters, field hospitals, supplies, surgeons, and the wounded themselves. The farms around Antietam were therefore not just backdrops. They became instruments of survival. A barn could offer shelter. A farmhouse site could become a point of care. A road could carry men away from the firing line. A lantern could extend work into darkness. Water, food, and bandages became as urgent as ammunition had been only hours before. In this way, the aftermath revealed a different kind of logistics. Armies had arrived with rifles, artillery, wagons, orders, and plans. After the battle, the most important materials were simpler and more intimate: cloth for wounds, something to eat, something to drink, a light bright enough for a surgeon to keep working. That is where Clara Barton enters the Antietam story. About noon on September 17, 1862, while the battle was still unfolding, Barton arrived near the cornfield with medical supplies. The timing is important. She did not come only after the field had gone quiet. She reached the area while Antietam was still a living battle, while the morning's violence near Miller's cornfield and the surrounding ground had already created a crisis of care. The cornfield had been one of the battle's most punishing sectors, and by midday, the need for supplies was immediate. Barton brought what the wounded and the surgeons needed most: bandages, food, water, and lanterns. Her work at Antietam was practical mercy. It was not abstract sympathy from a safe distance. It was the carrying of supplies to a place where supplies were urgently needed. Bandages meant wounds could be dressed. Food and water meant men who had been exhausted by battle and injury could receive basic relief. Lanterns meant care could continue when daylight failed. These details are plain, but they are powerful because they show what compassion looked like under battlefield conditions. It did not always announce itself in grand words. Sometimes it arrived as a bundle of cloth, a container of water, a small light against the dark. Barton assisted both wounded soldiers and surgeons. That dual role matters. The wounded needed direct aid, but surgeons also needed support in order to keep working. Medical care in the aftermath of Antietam was not the work of one person or one place. It was a network of effort under pressure involving doctors, attendants, volunteers, soldiers, and civilians drawn toward the suffering the battle had created. Barton's arrival near the cornfield connects the violence of the morning to the long labor that followed. She stands at the junction between combat and care, between the place where men fell and the effort to keep them alive. Across the Antietam landscape, the living had to be moved into spaces that could become hospitals. At the Pry Barn and the nearby farm sites, the scale of treatment speaks to the enormity of the task. At least 1,500 men treated at those locations alone means that medical aftermath was not peripheral to the battle. It was one of the central facts of the day. The battle's more than 22,000 casualties were not just a statistic for later histories. They were men carried, examined, bandaged, fed, given water, and where possible, operated upon or comforted. Each one required time, hands, and materials. This is part of why Antietam forced the nation to see war differently. The field near Sharpsburg had already shown how quickly a rural landscape could be transformed by modern armies. But the hospitals showed what transformation meant after the shooting stopped. A headquarters became a medical center. Barns became treatment spaces. Farms became places of triage and endurance. The boundaries between civilian life and military necessity nearly vanished. The same countryside that had held harvests, livestock, family labor, and local roads now held the aftermath of the bloodiest single day in American military history. There is a quiet contradiction here. Antietam was a battle of enormous public consequence, a military event that helped create the opening for Abraham Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later. Yet its immediate aftermath was intensely private and physical. Before the battle could become policy, memory, or national turning point, it was pain. It was thirst. It was a surgeon needing light. It was a wounded man needing a bandage. It was a farm building filled with the consequences of decisions made by commanders and carried out by armies. The Pry House Rise helps us hold both truths at once. From there, the battle had been watched and directed. From there, the Army of the Potomac Medical Department had coordinated its work. Around it, at the Pry Barn, the R.F. Kennedy Farm, and the Henry Neikirk Farm, the aftermath became visible in human form. These were not symbolic places at the time. They were working sites in a medical emergency. Their later meaning comes from what happened there, from the number of men treated there, and from the way their ordinary structures were pulled into the history of the war. By the time darkness settled over the field, lanterns mattered. The day that had begun with attacks near the Cornfield had moved through woods, roads, bridges, and ridges, and had ended with thousands needing care. Clara Barton's supplies, Dr. Letterman's medical headquarters, the converted barns and farms, the labor of surgeons and assistants, all of these belong to the same Antietam as the charges and counterattacks. They show that the battle's violence did not end when the firing stopped. It changed form, and soon another form of witness would arrive. The wounded were being treated, and the dead had not yet all been buried when the battlefield began to enter public memory through a new and unsettling medium. The farms and fields of Antietam would not remain only in reports, letters, or official counts. Within days, a camera would face the ground where the armies had fought, and the nation would be asked to look. The camera arrived while Antietam was still becoming an aftermath. The wounded were still being treated in barns and farm buildings. The medical work centered around places like the Pry property, the R.F. Kennedy Farm, and the Henry Neikirk Farm had not erased the presence of the battle from the land. It had only gathered part of its human cost into places where surgeons, assistants, and volunteers could work. Beyond those places, the fields, roads, woods, and ridges near Sharpsburg still held another part of the story. The dead had not yet all been buried. 2 days after the battle, Alexander Gardner began photographing the Antietam battlefield. Gardner was employed by Matthew Brady, whose name was already tied to Civil War photography. But on this ground, the camera did something that written language could not do in the same way. It did not describe the battlefield from a distance. It faced it. It fixed the visible aftermath onto plates before burial had completed the first work of concealment. In the days after September 17, 1862, Gardner made 70 images of the field. That timing matters. Antietam had already been measured in military terms. The armies had fought near Sharpsburg in Washington County, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had met in a day of combat that became the bloodiest single day in American military history. The casualty totals are commonly reported at more than 22,000 and often around 22,717 to 23,000 killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Those numbers tell the scale. But numbers, even when they are accurate, remain abstract. They ask the listener or reader to imagine what thousands mean. Gardner's photographs shorten that distance. The battlefield he photographed was not a symbolic field. It was the same landscape through which this story has been moving. Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church area, the sunken road, later remembered as Bloody Lane, the crossings over Antietam Creek, the fields of the late-day attack. The camera entered a geography already charged with military meaning. A cornfield had become a killing ground. A quiet church built by local German Baptist brethren had become a landmark in a struggle on Lee's left. A sunken farm road had become a defensive position and then one of the defining images of the battle. A stone bridge known in 1862 as the Rohrbach or Lower Bridge had become a place where a small Confederate force could delay a much larger Union attack. Gardner's work did not create those events. It followed them. But it changed how they could be encountered. Before photographs, a battlefield reached the public through dispatches, official reports, casualty lists, maps, letters, and rumor. Those forms still mattered. They carried names, units, claims, and explanations. They shaped how people understood command decisions, victory, defeat, sacrifice, and blame. But a photograph carried a different kind of authority. It showed the ground after the speeches had stopped and before memory had softened the view. It placed the viewer, however imperfectly, in front of the evidence of death. At Antietam, that evidence was unusually immediate. Gardner began his work only 2 days after the battle. The dead had not yet been buried. The field was not yet restored to the routines of farming, travel, and church-going. It had not yet become a preserved site, a monument landscape, or a place visited through paths and plaques. It was still the raw aftermath of a fight that had run from dawn toward sunset, moving through separate sectors but leaving one connected wound across the countryside. The photographs became part of how Antietam entered public memory because they forced a new relationship between civilians and war. Americans far from Sharpsburg could no longer rely only on heroic language, patriotic abstraction, or the tidy distance of printed casualty figures. They could see that the war had bodies. They could see that a battlefield was not merely a place where maneuvers happened, where lines advanced or fell back, where generals tested one another's will. It was also a place where the final position of a soldier might be on open ground, beside a road, in the shadow of a fence, or near a landmark that had once belonged to ordinary rural life. This was one of Antietam's harsh lessons. The battle turned familiar materials into instruments of history. Corn became cover and concealment. Woods became contested space. A country lane became a trench-like defensive line. A bridge became a bottleneck. Barns became hospitals. A farmhouse became a headquarters. And then the camera turned the battlefield itself into public evidence. The word evidence is important here. Gardner's photographs did not settle every argument about Antietam. They did not explain all command decisions. They did not tell why McClellan, even after receiving Lee's Special Orders number 191 days earlier, failed to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. They did not calculate the effect of South Mountain, or Harper's Ferry, or A.P. Hill's march from the Harper's Ferry operation to the Union left. They did not explain every delay at the lower bridge or every attack in the cornfield. A photograph does not replace analysis, but it can make denial harder. It can make the cost visible in a way that words often struggle to sustain. After Antietam, the public could be asked not simply to honor the dead in principle, but to look toward the ground where they had fallen. The images made the battlefield less distant and less easily romanticized. They drew the home front closer to the front line, not through imagination alone, but through a visual record made before the dead had disappeared beneath the soil. This was still an early moment in the relationship between war and photography. The camera was not moving with the speed of later technologies. It could not capture the charge in motion or the instant of impact. Gardner photographed aftermath, not combat. Yet that limitation gave the images their own gravity. They were quiet because the guns had already stopped. They were still because the movement had ended. They showed what remained when command, courage, confusion, and terror had passed through a place and left it altered. In that sense, Gardner's photographs belong beside the medical story, not apart from it. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's headquarters at the Pry property, the treatment of at least 1,500 men at the Pry barn and nearby farm sites, Clara Barton's arrival near the cornfield with bandages, food, water, and lanterns, all of these reveal the battle after the battle. Gardner's images did the same in another register. Medicine tried to save the living. Burial would care for the dead. Photography witnessed the interval before the land could hide what had happened. And because Antietam itself became a turning point, the photographs carried more than battlefield sorrow. They became attached to a moment when the meaning of the war was about to shift. The battle had been tactically inconclusive, but its consequences were not neutral. Lee's first invasion of the North was stopped. The Army of Northern Virginia would withdraw back across the Potomac River into Virginia. The Union could claim enough of a success for Abraham Lincoln to act. That political meaning did not erase what Gardner photographed. It made the contradiction sharper. The road toward a new national purpose passed through a field of unburied dead. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation would come 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862. It would transform the war's stated direction, tying Union victory more directly to emancipation as well as reunion. But before the proclamation entered the public record, Gardner's camera had already entered the battlefield, so Antietam reached the nation in two powerful forms: as a military event that ended Lee's Maryland campaign, and as a visual shock that made the cost of that event harder to look away from. The photographs did not speak in the language of policy. They did not announce a new war aim. They showed the price already paid on the ground near Sharpsburg. And from that ground, the country moved toward a decision that would change what the war was for. And from that ground, the country moved toward a decision that would change what the war was for. Antietam did not end with a clean battlefield victory. It did not end with one army destroyed and the other standing untouched. It did not offer the kind of simple conclusion that commanders could easily turn into a perfect military story. The fields near Sharpsburg held something more complicated: a terrible Union success, a stopped invasion, and a cost so visible that it forced the nation to reckon with the direction of the war. For Robert E. Lee, the Maryland campaign had reached its limit. His army had crossed into Maryland with large ambitions: to shift the war away from the South, to threaten federal territory, to influence Northern politics, and to strengthen the possibility that European powers might recognize the Confederacy. But after the fighting along Antietam Creek, those hopes could not be carried farther north. Lee withdrew back across the Potomac River into Virginia. That movement mattered. It ended his first invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia had not been annihilated, and the battle itself is often described as tactically inconclusive. But strategy is not always measured by annihilation. Sometimes it is measured by what does not happen next. Lee did not remain in Maryland. He did not press deeper into federal territory. The campaign that had brought the war into Washington County, Maryland, and turned the farms around Sharpsburg into a killing ground had been stopped. For Abraham Lincoln, that was enough. The president had already been considering a policy that would link the survival of the Union to the destruction of slavery in areas fighting against it. But such a measure needed a moment. Issued after a clear Union defeat, it might look like desperation. Issued after the Confederate advance had been checked, it could be presented as an act of national power. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The timing is one of the central reasons Antietam occupies such a powerful place in American history. A battle fought along a quiet creek in western Maryland became the military event that opened the political door. The connection was not simple triumph. It was not a victory parade emerging from an uncontested field. It was a government choosing to act after a day of staggering violence had halted a Confederate invasion. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation announced a warning and a direction. It declared that on the first day of January, 1863, enslaved people in areas still in rebellion against the United States would be declared free. It gave the Confederate States a deadline. It also signaled that the war itself was changing. When the final Emancipation Proclamation came on January 1, 1863, it applied to areas in rebellion. That phrase is essential. The proclamation did not apply everywhere slavery existed. It did not free enslaved people in the loyal slaveholding border states. It also exempted some Union-controlled Confederate areas. And it did not free enslaved people in Maryland. That fact brings the story back to the ground around Antietam in a hard and revealing way. The battle that helped make emancipation a Union war aim was fought in a slaveholding state that remained loyal to the United States. Because Maryland was a loyal border state, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply there. The National Park Service notes that roughly 87,000 enslaved people in Maryland were not freed by it. So the transformation was real, but it was not complete. The proclamation was both a moral turning point and a wartime measure shaped by constitutional limits military necessity, and political caution. It reached into places defined as being in rebellion. It did not reach into every place where slavery still existed. For the enslaved people of Maryland, freedom would not come through Lincoln's Proclamation. Maryland abolished slavery later, through a new state constitution in 1864. That contradiction is part of the meaning of Antietam. The battle helped force a new national purpose, but that purpose emerged through the imperfect machinery of war and government. The country did not step instantly from bloodshed into justice. It moved unevenly, under pressure, through policy, military action, political calculation, and the continued actions of enslaved people and free black communities who understood that the war's meaning was being contested in real time. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation changed the character of the Civil War. The National Archives states that it transformed the war and authorized the acceptance of black men into the Union Army and Navy. This was not only a statement about freedom on paper. It altered the military structure of the Union cause. Black men could now serve openly in the armed forces of the United States, fighting for a government that had moved from preserving the Union alone toward a war also aimed at destroying slavery in the rebellious states. By the end of the Civil War, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had served for the Union. That number carries the story far beyond Antietam Creek. It points toward recruiting stations, military camps, naval vessels, infantry regiments, and battlefields still to come. It points toward men who entered the war not as passive symbols of policy, but as participants in the destruction of slavery and the preservation of the United States. The proclamation did not only redefine what Union armies fought against, it helped redefine who could fight for the Union. And that, too, reaches back to September 17, 1862. The battle near Sharpsburg had been fought by armies under George B. McClellan and Robert E. Lee. It had unfolded across Miller's Cornfield, the West Woods, the Dunker Church, the Sunken Road, the Lower Bridge, and the southern fields where the late attack was stopped. It had left more than 22,000 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured in roughly 12 hours. It had brought surgeons, civilians, relief workers, and photographers into a landscape still marked by the day's violence. But its consequences did not remain in Maryland. Lee's withdrawal across the Potomac ended the immediate threat of his first northern invasion. Lincoln's proclamation gave the Union cause a new public meaning. The photographs made the cost visible. The policy that followed made the war more openly about slavery's destruction. This is why Antietam can feel difficult to name. It was not a clean victory, yet it changed the direction of the war. It was not fought as an emancipation battle in the minds of every man who entered the field, yet it became inseparable from emancipation's advance. It did not free the enslaved people living in the state where the battle took place, yet it helped produce the measure that declared freedom for enslaved people in areas still rebelling against the United States. The meaning of Antietam lies in that tension. A creek, a town, a set of farms, and a line of roads became the place where military outcome and national purpose met. The battle stopped Lee's Maryland campaign. It gave Lincoln the opening he needed. It helped turn the Civil War from a struggle only to restore the Union into a struggle that would also strike at slavery as the foundation of the rebellion. The landscape itself remained. Antietam Creek continued to move through the Maryland countryside. The fields returned, season by season, to agriculture and memory. The Dunker Church, the farms, the bridge, the sunken road, and the ridges all carried names that would no longer sound ordinary in American history. But after September 17, 1862, the war was no longer moving along the same path. The bloodiest single day in American military history did not solve the nation's crisis. It did not end slavery by itself. It did not end the Civil War, but it forced a turning. It brought the Confederate invasion of the North to a halt, and from the terrible aftermath near Sharpsburg came the political moment for a proclamation that changed the Union's cause. Antietam was a battlefield of corn, stone, wood, water, smoke, and road dust. It was also a threshold. On one side stood the war as it had been announced in 1861, a fight to preserve the Union. On the other side stood a broader and more difficult war, a war in which Union victory would be tied to emancipation and in which black soldiers and sailors would help carry that cause forward. The day ended in exhaustion and grief. The campaign ended with Lee back across the Potomac, 5 days later, the words of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation began to give the bloodshed a different national meaning. That is the legacy of Antietam. Not victory without ambiguity, not freedom without limits, not memory without pain, but a moment when the United States, standing amid the cost of war, began to become something else.